My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I thought I knew what betrayal looked like until my own family taught me otherwise. For 26 years, I believed that blood meant something, that shared memories created unbreakable bonds, that the people who raised you would never deliberately destroy you. I was wrong about all of it. The day they divided my grandfather's millions right in front of me, treating me like I was invisible, I learned that greed can turn a family into strangers faster than death ever could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what they didn't know, what none of us knew sitting in that sterile conference room, was that Grandpa Bobby had been watching them for years. He'd seen the way they circled his success like vultures, measuring his worth in dollar signs rather than decades of sacrifice. And he'd prepared for this moment in ways that would leave them speechless and me questioning everything I thought I understood about justice. The smell of fresh bread and disappointment had become my daily reality. Every morning at 5:30, I'd drag myself out of bed in the cramped studio apartment above Murphy's Bakery, where the walls were so thin I could hear Mrs. Murphy arguing with suppliers through the floorboards. The space barely qualified as living quarters, just 400 square feet of chipped paint and memories I'd rather forget, but it was all I could afford on a baker's assistant salary. Grandpa Bobby had been gone for 3 months, and I was still catching myself reaching for my phone to call him whenever something good or terrible happened. He'd raised me after my parents' messy divorce left me bouncing between houses where I never quite belonged. Bobby Mitchell was the one constant in my chaotic childhood, the man who taught me how to change a tire, how to read people's intentions, and how to stand up straight even when life was trying to knock you down. His auto parts empire had started with a single garage in downtown Riverside, back when the steel mills were still running and this Ohio town had hope. By the time I was old enough to understand business, Mitchell's Auto Parts had grown into 3 locations with a distribution network that reached 5 states. Bobby never talked much about money, but everyone in Riverside knew he'd built something substantial from nothing more than calloused hands and an unwillingness to quit. The morning of the will reading, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror trying to make myself look presentable. The black dress I'd borrowed from my coworker hung loose in all the wrong places, and my shoes had a scuff mark I couldn't quite buff out. I'd been working double shifts since Bobby's funeral, trying to save enough money to maybe take some business classes at the community college. He'd always said I had a head for numbers and a heart too big for my own good. Now I wondered if either of those things would matter anymore. The text from my mother had been brief and businesslike, the way most of our communication had become over the years. Will reading today at 2 p.m., Hayes and Associates downtown, don't be late, no mention of how I was doing, no acknowledgement that I'd been the one spending nights at the hospital while Bobby fought his final battle with emphysema. Just the facts, delivered with the warmth of a legal document. I walked the 12 blocks to the law office because I couldn't afford the parking downtown. Riverside's Main Street told the story of a town that had seen better days, with more empty storefronts than thriving businesses, but there were still pockets of life if you knew where to look. Bobby had always pointed out the small signs of resilience during our walks together: a new coat of paint on an old building, a hand-painted sign advertising fresh coffee, anything that showed people hadn't given up entirely. Hayes and Associates occupied the second floor of a brick building that had probably been elegant in the 1950s. The elevator wheezed its way upward, and I found myself holding my breath, though whether from nerves or the mechanical uncertainty, I couldn't tell. The waiting area was all beige carpet and artificial plants, the kind of studied neutrality that was supposed to be calming but only made me feel more anxious. My family was already there, clustered together on the far side of the room like they were attending a board meeting rather than mourning a patriarch. My mother, Linda, wore a navy suit that probably cost more than I made in 2 months, her blonde hair pulled back in the kind of perfect chignon that required professional maintenance. She glanced up when I walked in, offering a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes before returning to her hushed conversation with my Uncle Tom. Tom Mitchell had inherited Bobby's height but none of his warmth. Where Bobby had been built like a man who'd worked with his hands, Tom carried himself with the soft confidence of someone who'd spent most of his adult life in air-conditioned offices. He managed the business side of the auto parts empire, the contracts and negotiations that kept the money flowing, while Bobby focused on the customers and quality control. My older brother Kevin sat slightly apart from the main group, scrolling through his phone with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was avoiding eye contact. Kevin had always been ambitious in ways that made Bobby uncomfortable, more interested in leveraging the family business into something bigger and flashier than in understanding what made it work in the first place. His girlfriend, a real estate agent named Monica who treated our family gatherings like networking events, whispered something in his ear that made him chuckle. Jessica, Tom's daughter, was the only one who looked genuinely sad. Her eyes were red-rimmed behind fashionable glasses, and she clutched a tissue like a lifeline. Jessica had moved back to Riverside after college to help with the marketing side of the business, and she'd been Bobby's favorite among the grandchildren until I came along. There had been a time when we were close, bonding over shared frustrations with our parents and dreams of making something meaningful out of our lives. That closeness had faded as the family dynamics grew more complicated, but seeing her grief reminded me that she'd loved Bobby too, in her own way. A receptionist with kind eyes and a tired voice called us into the conference room at exactly 2 o'clock. The space was dominated by a mahogany table that reflected the afternoon light streaming through tall windows, and I found myself wondering if Bobby would have been comfortable in such formal surroundings. He'd always preferred the cluttered office at the back of his original garage, where the coffee was strong and the conversations were honest. The lawyer who greeted us was not Margaret Hayes, Bobby's attorney for the past 15 years. Instead, a woman I'd never seen before introduced herself as Patricia Wells, explaining that Mrs. Hayes had retired suddenly due to health issues and that she'd be handling the estate proceedings. Something about her manner felt rehearsed, like she'd given this same explanation multiple times, but everyone else seemed to accept it without question. Patricia Wells had the kind of aggressive politeness that immediately put me on edge. Her handshake lasted a fraction too long, her smile was a degree too bright, and she had a habit of using people's names in every sentence like she'd read a book about building rapport. She arranged her papers with theatrical precision before beginning what felt more like a performance than a legal proceeding. She started with the standard legal language about Bobby's final wishes and the distribution of his earthly possessions, but I found it hard to concentrate on her words. Instead, I kept thinking about the last real conversation I'd had with Bobby, just 2 weeks before his death. We'd been sitting on the porch of the old farmhouse, watching the sun set over the cornfields that stretched toward the horizon. He'd seemed unusually reflective that evening, talking about legacy and the difference between what people leave behind and what they actually pass on. He'd told me about growing up during the Depression, about watching his own father lose the family farm to creditors who smiled.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
While they foreclosed. That experience had shaped everything about how Bobby approached money and success, making him cautious about debt and generous with opportunities. He'd put 3 kids through college, helped countless employees start their own businesses, and quietly supported half the charitable organizations in Riverside without ever wanting his name on a building. Patricia Wells cleared her throat, bringing my attention back to the present moment. She held up a thick envelope with the solemnity of someone unveiling a work of art, and I noticed that her hands were perfectly manicured in a way that suggested she'd never changed a tire or baked bread at 5 in the morning. The envelope bore Bobby's name in flowing script, and she made a show of breaking the wax seal before extracting several sheets of cream-colored paper. The reading began with the smaller bequests, the personal items that carried more sentimental than monetary value. Bobby's watch collection went to Kevin, who nodded with satisfaction despite having never shown interest in timepieces. His fishing equipment and hunting rifles were divided between Tom and a cousin from Pennsylvania who hadn't visited in years. Jessica received his collection of first-edition automotive manuals, books she'd probably never open but that represented thousands of dollars to the right collector. I received his toolbox, the same battered metal case he'd carried since his days as a young mechanic. It was a thoughtful gesture that acknowledged our shared love of fixing things, but in the context of what was surely a multi-million-dollar estate, it felt almost insulting in its modesty. I tried to keep my expression neutral, reminding myself that the monetary value of inheritance had never been the point of my relationship with Bobby. Then Patricia Wells moved on to the substantial assets, and the atmosphere in the room shifted like a weather front moving through. The auto parts business, with its 3 locations and established customer base, was being divided equally between Tom and Kevin. The downtown rental properties, 2 Victorian houses that generated steady income, were going to Linda and Jessica. The farmhouse and its 38 acres, the land where Bobby had planned to retire and raise horses, was designated for sale with the proceeds to be distributed among the 4 of them. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as the pattern became clear. Every significant asset, every source of ongoing income, every piece of real wealth was being parceled out among my family members while I sat there holding the deed to a toolbox. It wasn't just the money, though the financial disparity was stark enough to leave me breathless. It was the message being sent, the clear indication that I had mattered less to Bobby than everyone else in that room. Kevin was already pulling out his phone, probably calculating his share of the business value. Tom leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone whose expectations had been exceeded. Linda examined her nails with studied indifference, but I caught the small smile she tried to hide. Even Jessica seemed pleased despite her earlier tears, no doubt thinking about the rental income that would supplement her marketing salary. Patricia Wells wasn't finished yet. She reached for another envelope, this one sealed with red wax, and announced that Bobby had established a charitable foundation with a substantial endowment. The Robert Mitchell Foundation would focus on supporting local small businesses and educational opportunities for young people in Riverside. It was exactly the kind of legacy project that would have made Bobby proud, except for one detail that made my chest tighten with confusion and hurt. The foundation's board of directors included Tom, Kevin, Linda, and Jessica. My name appeared nowhere in the documentation, not even as an alternate or advisory member. I had been completely excluded from the philanthropic work that should have been closest to Bobby's heart, the kind of community support that he'd talked about during our long conversations about making a real difference in people's lives. The numbers were staggering when Patricia Wells finally laid them all out. The total estate value approached $2.8 million, a fortune built from Bobby's lifetime of careful investments and business acumen. The auto parts business alone was worth over $1 million, not counting the inventory and established customer relationships that would generate income for years to come. The rental properties had appreciated significantly since Bobby purchased them in the 1980s, and the farmland was worth far more than anyone had expected due to recent development pressure on the outskirts of Riverside. I found myself doing mental calculations despite my emotional turmoil. Kevin and Tom would each control business interests worth hundreds of thousands of dollars immediately, with the potential for much more as the company continued to grow. Linda and Jessica would enjoy steady rental income that exceeded what most people in Riverside earned from full-time jobs. Even the charitable foundation represented a form of wealth, providing them with social prestige and the power to influence community development. My inheritance, by contrast, consisted of Bobby's toolbox and a small savings account that held exactly $3,000. It was enough to cover a few months of rent on my studio apartment, hardly life-changing money in any meaningful sense. The disparity was so extreme that I wondered if there had been some kind of mistake, if perhaps Patricia Wells had confused me with someone else, or if pages were missing from the will. But Patricia Wells seemed quite certain of the arrangements, and she began explaining the next steps with the brisk efficiency of someone who had handled many similar proceedings. There were tax implications to consider, business transfers to arrange, and property deeds to update. She handed out thick folders containing the relevant documentation, and I noticed that mine was considerably thinner than everyone else's. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises to stay in touch about the various administrative details. My family members chatted among themselves about their plans for their inheritances, their voices carrying the excitement of people who had just received unexpected windfalls. Tom mentioned upgrading the auto parts inventory system. Kevin talked about expanding into online sales. Linda discussed renovating the rental properties to command higher rents. I stood by the conference room windows, looking down at the Riverside Street scene below and trying to process what had just happened. Cars moved slowly through the afternoon traffic, people walked purposefully toward destinations that mattered to them, and the world continued turning as if nothing significant had occurred. But inside that conference room, my understanding of my place in the Mitchell family had been permanently altered. The cruelest part wasn't even the money, though the financial implications would affect every aspect of my future. It was the recognition that Bobby had seen me differently than I'd believed, that the grandfather who had seemed to value my character over my ambition had ultimately chosen to reward the very qualities in my relatives that he'd appeared to criticize. Perhaps I'd misunderstood our relationship, reading more significance into our shared time than had actually existed. Jessica approached me as the others prepared to leave, her expression mixing sympathy with obvious discomfort. She'd always been better than the rest of my family at acknowledging emotional complexity, even when she couldn't quite bridge the gap between understanding and action. Her voice was soft when she spoke, but her words carried the particular kind of hurt that comes from people who care about you but won't risk confronting injustice on your behalf. She suggested that perhaps Bobby had believed I was young enough to build my own wealth, that maybe he'd wanted to challenge me to prove myself independently rather than rely on inherited advantages. It was a generous interpretation that ignored the obvious favoritism shown to Kevin, who was only 3 years older than me, and Jessica herself, who had been given opportunities I'd never received. But I appreciated her attempt to find meaning in what felt like a deliberate rejection. The others had already left by the time I gathered the courage to ask Patricia Wells directly about the disparity in the inheritances. Her response was professional but dismissive, explaining that estate planning often reflected complex family considerations that weren't apparent to outside observers. She suggested that Bobby had undoubtedly had his reasons for the distribution choices, and that questioning a deceased person's final wishes was both inappropriate and legally pointless. I walked slowly back to my studio apartment, taking the long route through Riverside's residential neighborhoods where Bobby and I had often driven during his final months. He'd liked to point out the houses where his employees lived, the small businesses that bought parts from him, the subtle signs of a community that had learned to survive economic hardship through mutual support. Those conversations had felt like lessons in values, in the kind of success that couldn't be measured purely in financial terms. Now I wondered if I'd been naive to believe that Bobby shared those values, or if perhaps he'd seen something in my character that made him doubt my ability to handle substantial wealth responsibly. The toolbox sitting on my kitchen table seemed to mock my earlier sentimentality about our relationship. It was a generous gift from a grandfather to a granddaughter who shared his mechanical interests, but it was also a clear statement about my relative importance in his final considerations. The evening stretched ahead of me with the weight of forced solitude. There would be no celebratory dinner, no excited phone calls to friends, no planning sessions about how to use my inheritance wisely. Instead, there was just the familiar sound of Murphy's Bakery closing below, the distant hum of traffic on Main Street, and the growing realization that my future looked exactly like my present, only with less hope for meaningful change. I opened Bobby's toolbox as darkness settled over Riverside, running my fingers over the worn handles of screwdrivers and wrenches that had built an empire I would never inherit. Each tool told a story of problems solved and challenges overcome, of a man who had believed that good work and honest dealing would eventually be rewarded. Perhaps that was the real lesson Bobby had intended to leave me, not through words or money, but through the example of these simple instruments that had created something substantial from nothing more than determination and time. But as I sat alone in my small apartment, surrounded by the sense of tomorrow's bread and the sounds of a town settling into evening routines, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were parts of this story I didn't yet understand. Bobby had been many things, but careless about important decisions was not one of them. Everything about the will reading felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate, as if I'd been watching a performance rather than witnessing the genuine final wishes of a man who had spent his life thinking carefully about consequences. The mystery would have to wait though. Tomorrow would bring another early morning at the bakery, another day of measuring flour and kneading dough while my family members began the process of claiming their inheritances. Whatever questions I had about Bobby's intentions would have to compete with the immediate need to pay rent and buy groceries, to survive in a world where $3,000 represented temporary security rather than lasting change. I closed the toolbox and prepared for bed, trying to convince myself that Bobby's lessons about resilience and self-reliance would prove more valuable than any amount of money. But in the darkness of my studio apartment, with the weight of exclusion settling around me like a familiar blanket, it was hard to believe that love and respect could be measured in anything other than the concrete choices people made about sharing their resources with those who mattered most to them. Parts 2-5 The betrayal deepens and truth emerges. The days following the will reading blurred together in a haze of disbelief and grinding routine. I'd wake before dawn to the sound of delivery trucks rumbling past my window, dress in flour-dusted clothes, and spend my mornings mixing dough while trying to make sense of what had happened in that sterile conference room. The weight of exclusion sat heavy in my chest, a constant ache that no amount of physical labor could relieve. Mrs. Murphy had been running her bakery for 37 years, and she possessed the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from watching people struggle through difficult seasons. She never asked direct questions about the will reading, but I caught her studying my face with the concern of someone who recognized grief in its many forms. When she handed me my weekly paycheck that Friday, she included an extra $20 with a note that simply read "for emergencies." It was a small kindness that brought tears I'd been holding back for days. The first real blow came on Saturday morning, when I walked past the auto parts store on my way to buy groceries with my carefully calculated budget. Through the large front windows, I could see Kevin and Tom in animated discussion with a man I didn't recognize, someone in an expensive suit who gestured at clipboards and architectural drawings. A banner stretched across the storefront announcing future site of Mitchell Auto Superstore coming spring 2024. The expansion Bobby had always resisted, the corporate transformation he'd feared would destroy the personal relationships that made the business successful, was already moving forward. I pressed my face against the cool glass, trying to understand the timeline that would allow such rapid changes. Bobby had been dead for less than a week since the will reading, yet they were already planning renovations that would require months of preparation and significant financial investment. Either they had been planning this transformation while Bobby was still alive, deliberately moving forward with decisions they knew he would oppose, or they had acted with remarkable speed to capitalize on their newfound control. Kevin emerged from the store just as I was turning to leave, his face flushed with the excitement of someone implementing long-delayed plans. He wore a new leather jacket that probably cost more than I made in a month, and his confidence seemed to radiate from every gesture. When he spotted me on the sidewalk, his expression shifted to something between embarrassment and defensive irritation, as if my presence was an inconvenient reminder of complications he preferred to ignore. He approached with the forced casualness of someone delivering rehearsed lines, asking how I was adjusting to life after the reading, and whether I had plans for my inheritance. The question felt deliberately cruel, given that my entire inheritance consisted of tools and pocket change, but Kevin's tone suggested genuine obliviousness to the disparity. He seemed to believe that receiving anything at all should inspire gratitude rather than questions about fairness or family loyalty. When I mentioned the speed of the expansion plans, Kevin's demeanor shifted noticeably. He explained that opportunities in retail development required quick decisions, that successful businesses couldn't afford to be sentimental about growth strategies. The words sounded like quotes from business magazines rather than personal convictions, and I realized that Kevin had been preparing for this moment longer than any of us had understood. The expansion wasn't a response to Bobby's death, it was the culmination of plans that had been waiting for his opposition to disappear. The conversation left me feeling hollow and displaced, like a character who had been written out of a story I'd thought I was helping to create. I walked the remaining blocks to the grocery store in a daze, mechanically selecting the cheapest options for meals that would stretch my limited budget through another week. The normalcy of other shoppers discussing weekend plans and comparing prices felt surreal against the backdrop of my family's rapid transformation of everything Bobby had built. That evening, I called Margaret Hayes, Bobby's longtime attorney, hoping to find some explanation for the dramatic changes in his final wishes. The phone rang endlessly before connecting to a voicemail message that sounded nothing like the warm professional voice I remembered from previous conversations. Instead, a younger woman's voice announced that the number had been disconnected and provided no forwarding information. It was as if Margaret Hayes had simply vanished from professional existence, leaving no trace of the 15-year relationship she'd maintained with Bobby and his business affairs. I spent Sunday morning at the Riverside Public Library, using their computers to search for information about Patricia Wells and the firm that had handled the will reading. The results were puzzling and incomplete, showing a business registration that was less than 6 months old and a professional license that had been issued in a different state. For someone supposedly experienced in estate law, Patricia Wells had remarkably little digital presence or professional history that I could verify through public records. The library's reference librarian, a patient woman named Dorothy who had helped me with research projects since high school, showed me how to access the State Bar Association's attorney directory. Patricia Wells was listed, but her credentials seemed thin for someone handling complex estate work. Her law school graduation was recent, her previous employment history was vague, and she had no published articles or professional recognitions that would suggest expertise in inheritance law. Everything about her background felt hastily assembled rather than legitimately earned. I requested copies of the public probate filings, expecting to find detailed documentation of Bobby's estate distribution. Instead, I discovered that the will had been filed under an expedited process typically reserved for uncontested cases with clear beneficiaries. The paperwork bore stamps and signatures that looked official, but several elements seemed inconsistent with the procedures Margaret Hayes had used for other family legal matters over the years. Most troubling was the notary seal, which belonged to someone I'd never heard of despite Bobby's habit of using the same notary at Riverside First National for all his important documents. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that something fundamental was wrong with the entire will reading process. Bobby had been meticulous about legal documentation throughout his business career, maintaining detailed records and consulting with Margaret Hayes about every significant decision. The idea that he would suddenly change attorneys without explanation, revise his will using unfamiliar procedures, and exclude me so completely
from his legacy seemed completely inconsistent with the man I'd known and loved. Monday morning brought a phone call that changed everything. I was measuring ingredients for the day's bread production when Mrs. Murphy called me to the front counter, where a man in a rumpled gray suit waited with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. He introduced himself as David Rodriguez, a private investigator specializing in estate fraud, and asked if we could speak privately about my grandfather's will. David Rodriguez looked nothing like the polished attorneys and business consultants who had populated my recent experiences. His suit was well worn but clean, his shoes were practical rather than fashionable, and his demeanor suggested competence earned through experience rather than inherited through privilege. He carried a leather portfolio that had seen years of use, and his handshake conveyed the kind of strength that comes from genuine work rather than gymnasium exercises. He explained that he'd been contacted by Margaret Hayes, who had not retired due to health issues as Patricia Wells claimed. Instead, Margaret had been deliberately excluded from Bobby's estate proceedings through a series of legal maneuvers that she was now working to understand and challenge. She had spent the past week reviewing public records and interviewing witnesses, and her preliminary investigation suggested systematic fraud in the handling of Bobby's final wishes. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, confirming suspicions I'd been afraid to voice even to myself. Margaret Hayes had been more than Bobby's attorney. She'd been a trusted friend who understood his values and intentions better than anyone outside the family. The idea that she would suddenly abandon her responsibilities due to mysterious health problems had never made sense, but I'd accepted the explanation because the alternative seemed too complex and disturbing to consider. David Rodriguez opened his portfolio and showed me photocopies of documents that told a completely different story than the one presented at the will reading. Margaret Hayes had indeed prepared a final will for Bobby, but it bore little resemblance to the version Patricia Wells had read to our family. The authentic will, dated just 6 weeks before Bobby's death and bearing his unmistakable signature, painted a picture of inheritance distribution that was both more generous and more thoughtful than what had been presented. According to Margaret's documentation, I was designated as the primary beneficiary of Bobby's personal assets, including the farmhouse and land that held so many of our shared memories. The auto parts business was structured as a partnership arrangement that would have given me significant input into major decisions while allowing Tom and Kevin to handle day-to-day operations. Most significantly, there was mention of investment accounts and business partnerships that had never been discussed during the will reading, assets that could potentially dwarf the value of the properties and business interests that had been distributed. The scope of the deception was staggering in its complexity and deliberateness. Someone had not only forged documents and impersonated legal authorities, but they had also coordinated the timing and presentation with enough sophistication to fool people who should have been difficult to deceive. The logistics alone suggested planning had been underway for months, possibly even while Bobby was still alive and fighting his final illness. David Rodriguez explained that estate fraud cases were often complicated by family dynamics and the emotional vulnerability that follows death. Perpetrators relied on grief and confusion to prevent careful scrutiny of legal proceedings, and they often succeeded because beneficiaries were reluctant to challenge decisions that appeared to have official approval. In this case, the fraud had been particularly effective because it exploited my family's existing tensions and assumptions about inheritance fairness. He showed me a timeline that made the criminal nature of the deception impossible to ignore. The false will had been filed using forged signatures and a notary seal belonging to someone who had been deceased for over a year. Patricia Wells had presented credentials from a law firm that existed only on paper, with a business address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service in another state. Even the conference room where we'd met had been rented for a single day, creating the appearance of an established legal practice that was entirely fabricated. The investigation had revealed financial records showing suspicious transactions in the weeks following Bobby's death. Large sums had been transferred from business accounts to personal holdings controlled by Tom and Kevin, movements that should have required probate court approval but had been processed using falsified authorizations. The auto parts inventory had been liquidated and sold to a company that existed only as a shell corporation registered to addresses that led nowhere when investigated. Most damning of all, David Rodriguez had discovered evidence that the conspiracy had begun while Bobby was still alive but incapacitated by his final illness. Phone records showed extensive communication between Tom, Kevin, and Patricia Wells during the period when Bobby was hospitalized and unable to oversee his business affairs. Email exchanges discussed strategies for expediting probate proceedings and minimizing the potential for challenges to the estate distribution. The betrayal was more complete and calculating than I had imagined possible, extending far beyond simple greed into territory that seemed almost sociopathic in its coldness. These were people who had sat at Bobby's bedside, who had accepted his generosity for decades, who had built their own financial security on the foundation of his success. Yet they had been willing to systematically destroy his final wishes and steal what he had intended as my inheritance without apparent regard for the emotional devastation they would cause. David Rodriguez asked if I was prepared to pursue legal action to recover what had been stolen, warning that the process would be lengthy, expensive, and emotionally draining. The evidence was strong, but estate fraud cases often became bitter family conflicts that could last for years and destroy relationships that had survived decades of other challenges. He needed to know if I had the financial resources and emotional resilience to endure what might become a very public legal battle. I thought about Bobby sitting on the farmhouse porch during our final conversations, talking about legacy and the importance of standing up for principles even when the cost was high. He had built his business and his reputation on the belief that honest work and fair dealing would eventually be rewarded, that people who chose integrity over convenience would find ways to sleep peacefully regardless of their bank account balances. The tools he had left me were symbols of those values, reminders that real wealth came from the ability to solve problems and create value rather than from inherited advantages. The decision felt inevitable once I understood the full scope of what had been taken from me. This wasn't just about money or property, though the financial implications would affect every aspect of my future. It was about honoring Bobby's memory by refusing to let his final wishes be perverted by people who had learned to see love as leverage and trust as weakness. If I didn't fight for the inheritance he had intended, I would be complicit in erasing everything he had tried to leave behind. David Rodriguez smiled when I told him I was ready to proceed with the investigation and legal action. He explained that Margaret Hayes had been waiting for my decision before moving forward with formal challenges to the fraudulent probate proceedings. Together they had already begun gathering evidence and preparing documentation that would be submitted to both the probate court and the district attorney's office, since the scope of the fraud warranted both civil and criminal investigations. The next phase would involve forensic accounting to trace the stolen assets, interviews with witnesses who could testify about Bobby's true intentions, and careful documentation of every aspect of the fraudulent scheme. It would require patience and courage, but David Rodriguez believed that the evidence was strong enough to not only recover my inheritance but also ensure that those responsible faced serious legal consequences for their actions. As I walked back to my apartment that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Bobby's death: hope tempered by determination. The weight of exclusion and grief was still there, but it was balanced now by the knowledge that I hadn't been abandoned or forgotten. Bobby had tried to protect me and provide for my future. Other people had simply stolen what he had intended to give. The fight to recover my inheritance would be difficult, but it would also be an act of love and loyalty that honored everything Bobby had taught me about standing up for what was right. The tools in his toolbox suddenly seemed less like consolation prizes and more like instruments of justice, reminders that real problems required patient work and the right equipment applied with skill and determination. Bobby had spent his life fixing things that other people had given up on, and now it was my turn to repair the damage that had been done to his final wishes and my future. The work would be hard, but I had learned from a master craftsman who believed that anything broken could be restored if you cared enough to do the job properly. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table and began organizing the documents David Rodriguez had given me, creating files and timelines that would help me understand every aspect of the fraud that had been perpetrated against Bobby's estate. The evidence was overwhelming and infuriating, but it was also empowering in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time since the will reading, I felt like I had agency in my own story, the ability to fight for justice rather than simply endure injustice. The investigation would take months, possibly years, but I was prepared for that timeline. Bobby had taught me that worthwhile achievements required patience and persistence, that shortcuts usually led to problems that were more expensive to fix than they had been to avoid in the first place. The people who had stolen my inheritance had chosen the shortcut of fraud and betrayal, and now they would discover the long-term costs of their decision. I opened Bobby's toolbox and selected a screwdriver, holding the worn handle and thinking about all the projects we had completed together over the years. Every repair had begun with careful assessment of the problem, identification of the right tools for the job, and systematic work that continued until everything functioned properly again. The investigation into estate fraud would follow the same principles, and I was confident that Bobby's lessons about patience and precision would serve me well in the legal battles ahead. The apartment felt less lonely that night, filled with the presence of purpose and the promise of justice that had been too long delayed. Tomorrow would bring another early morning at the bakery, but it would also bring progress toward recovering what had been stolen and ensuring that Bobby's true legacy survived the attempts to bury it beneath fraudulent documents and family betrayal. The work would be difficult, but it would also be deeply satisfying in ways that no amount of inherited money could have provided. I fell asleep that night with the sound of David Rodriguez's voice echoing in my memory, his promise that truth and persistence would eventually overcome even the most sophisticated fraud. The tools Bobby had left me were more powerful than I had understood, not because of their monetary value but because of the principles they represented and the skills they symbolized. The real inheritance wasn't money or property, it was the knowledge that problems could be solved and justice could be achieved if you were willing to do the work required. The morning brought news that changed everything once again. David Rodriguez called while I was preparing bread dough, his voice tight with excitement and barely controlled anger. Margaret Hayes had received a package delivered by courier, containing documents that revealed the existence of financial accounts that dwarfed everything that had been discussed during the fraudulent will reading. Bobby had maintained investment portfolios and business partnerships that were worth millions of dollars, assets that had been completely hidden from the estate proceedings. The package had come from an unexpected source, a bank in Chicago where Bobby had maintained accounts under a corporate structure that provided privacy and protection from exactly the kind of fraud that had been perpetrated against his estate. The bank's trust department had been monitoring news reports about probate proceedings in Riverside, and they had become concerned when the reported estate value seemed inconsistent with their records of Bobby's actual wealth. According to the Chicago bank's documentation, Bobby had been far wealthier than anyone in Riverside had understood, with investment accounts and business partnerships that generated substantial passive income. More importantly, these accounts had been structured with beneficiary designations that bypassed probate entirely, meaning that the fraudulent will had no legal authority over their distribution. The money was sitting in protected accounts, waiting for the legitimate beneficiaries to present proper identification and claim their inheritances. I was the primary beneficiary of accounts worth over $4 million, money that had been accumulating interest and investment returns for months while I struggled to pay rent on a studio apartment. The scope of Bobby's actual wealth made the fraud even more outrageous, but it also provided resources that would make the legal battle much more manageable. Instead of fighting for justice while facing financial hardship, I would be able to hire the best attorneys and investigators available. The revelation also explained why the fraudulent scheme had been so elaborate and well coordinated. Tom and Kevin had known about the Chicago accounts, and they had realized that simple inheritance manipulation wouldn't be sufficient to access the real wealth. They had needed to create a comprehensive fraud that would not only redirect the probate assets, but also provide them with documentation that could be used to make claims against the protected accounts. David Rodriguez explained that the Chicago bank had been suspicious of earlier attempts to access the accounts using questionable documentation. Patricia Wells had apparently contacted them multiple times, claiming to represent Bobby's estate and demanding information about account balances and beneficiary. The bank's security protocols had prevented any unauthorized access, but the attempts had been documented and would provide additional evidence of the criminal conspiracy. The scope of the deception was now revealed in its full magnitude, extending far beyond the simple theft of inheritance into sophisticated financial fraud that had been planned and executed with criminal precision. The people I had trusted as family had been willing to destroy not only my future but also Bobby's carefully constructed legacy of financial security and charitable giving. The betrayal was complete and calculated, lacking any trace of the love or loyalty that should have characterized family relationships. Margaret Hayes had already begun the process of contacting the Chicago bank to arrange for the legitimate transfer of the protected accounts. The documentation requirements were extensive, but David Rodriguez was confident that the evidence of fraud would actually expedite the process once bank officials understood the full scope of what had been attempted. The bank had security procedures designed specifically to prevent the kind of fraud that had been perpetrated, and they were prepared to cooperate fully with both civil and criminal investigations. I sat in Mrs. Murphy's bakery kitchen, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of honest work, and tried to comprehend the magnitude of what I had just learned. In the space of a few phone calls, I had gone from struggling to pay rent to being the beneficiary of millions of dollars in protected accounts. The transformation was so dramatic that it felt surreal, like a fantasy rather than a legal reality that would soon change every aspect of my life. But the money, significant as it was, felt less important than the vindication of Bobby's love and the confirmation that I had not been mistaken about our relationship. He had not forgotten me or excluded me from his legacy, he had simply been more careful about protecting what he intended to leave than any of us had understood. The Chicago accounts represented not just wealth, but also the proof that Bobby had seen me as worthy of his trust and investment in my future. The next few weeks would bring legal proceedings that would expose the full scope of the fraud and ensure that those responsible faced appropriate consequences. But for now I was content to knead bread dough and think about Bobby's wisdom in creating protections that had proved stronger than the betrayal of people who should have been trustworthy. The tools in his toolbox had taught me about the importance of using the right equipment for each job, and Bobby had clearly understood that protecting his legacy would require more sophisticated tools than anyone had imagined. Part 6, Miters 9, The Gaslighting Phase and Investigation. The call from my mother came at 6 in the morning, 3 days after David Rodriguez had revealed the truth about the Chicago accounts. Linda's voice carried that particular tone of controlled hysteria she'd perfected during my childhood, the sound of someone who believed that volume and persistence could reshape reality to match her preferences. She didn't bother with pleasantries or expressions of concern for my well-being. Instead, she launched directly into a monologue about family loyalty and the dangers of listening to strangers who promised easy solutions to complex problems. She had heard rumors, she said, about my involvement with some investigator who was asking questions around town. People were talking, creating unnecessary drama about family matters that should remain private. Her voice took on the syrupy quality she used when delivering ultimatums disguised as motherly advice, suggesting that I was being manipulated by professionals who profited from stirring up legal troubles between relatives who should be supporting each other during difficult times. The conversation felt like stepping back into a familiar nightmare, the kind of psychological manipulation that had characterized my relationship with Linda throughout my adult life. She possessed an extraordinary talent for reframing situations to cast herself as the victim and anyone who challenged her narrative as the aggressor. According to her version of recent events, I was the one causing problems by refusing to accept Bobby's final wishes gracefully, by allowing outsiders to poison my mind against family members who had always had my best interests at heart. She reminded me of all the times she had helped me over the years, conveniently forgetting that most of her assistance had come with conditions and expectations that made her generosity feel more like debt accumulation than genuine support. She spoke about the family's reputation in Riverside, about the importance of maintaining dignity during the grief process, about the harmful effects of legal disputes on everyone's emotional healing. Her words were carefully chosen to make me feel selfish and ungrateful for pursuing justice. When I mentioned the evidence David Rodriguez had shown me, Linda's tone shifted to outright dismissal. Documents could be fabricated, she explained with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged on factual matters. Private investigators were notorious for creating false evidence to justify their fees, especially when dealing with grieving relatives who were vulnerable to conspiracy theories. She had consulted with Tom and Kevin, and they all agreed that I was being taken advantage of by people who saw my emotional distress as an opportunity for financial gain. The gaslighting was so systematic and confident that I found myself momentarily doubting what I had seen with my own eyes. Linda had always possessed the ability to make me question my own perceptions, to wonder if my memory of events was somehow flawed or if my interpretation of other people's motivations was colored by paranoia or wishful thinking. Even knowing that she was lying, even having seen the documentary evidence of fraud, I felt the familiar pull of wanting to believe her version because it would be so much easier than fighting for the truth. She offered to meet for lunch to discuss the situation rationally, suggesting that face-to-face conversation would help us work through the misunderstandings that had been created by third parties. Her voice carried the promise of reconciliation and family unity, the possibility that all of this conflict could be resolved through simple communication and mutual forgiveness. It was a tempting offer, especially given the loneliness and isolation I had been feeling since the fraudulent will reading. But I had learned enough about manipulation tactics to recognize the pattern, the way abusive people alternated between aggression and false intimacy to maintain control over their victims. Linda's sudden interest in my emotional well-being was directly correlated to her fear about the investigation, not any genuine concern for my happiness or financial security. She was offering reconciliation because she needed my cooperation, not because she had experienced any change of heart about my value as a family member. I declined the lunch invitation and told her that all future communication would need to go through David Rodriguez and Margaret Hayes. The silence that followed was longer and more telling than any response she could have given. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all pretense of maternal warmth, revealing the cold calculation that had always been underneath her performance of family loyalty. She warned me that I would regret choosing strangers over blood relatives, that legal battles had a way of destroying relationships that could never be repaired. The threat was clear enough, but it also confirmed everything David Rodriguez had told me about the family's reaction to being exposed. People who were genuinely innocent of wrongdoing would welcome investigation as an opportunity to clear their names and restore family harmony. Only those who had something to hide would respond to evidence with intimidation and emotional manipulation designed to prevent further scrutiny of their actions. The phone call left me shaken but also more resolved to pursue justice regardless of the personal costs. Linda's desperation had revealed the weakness in their position, the fear that drove their attempts to control my response to the fraud. If they had been confident in their legal standing, they would have encouraged investigation rather than trying to prevent it through psychological pressure and family guilt. Kevin appeared at the bakery that afternoon, catching me during the brief lull between the lunch rush and dinner preparation. He wore his new leather jacket and an expression of carefully practiced concern, the kind of performance that suggested extensive rehearsal before an audience he hoped to convince. Mrs. Murphy directed him to the kitchen with obvious reluctance, her protective instincts recognizing predatory behavior even when she didn't understand the specific context. Kevin's approach was different from Linda's direct confrontation, relying instead on the shared history that had once made us close as siblings. He reminisced about childhood memories, about the times we had supported each other through difficult periods, about the bond that should make external conflicts irrelevant to our relationship. His voice carried the warmth of genuine nostalgia, and I found myself remembering the version of Kevin who had been my ally against parental dysfunction rather than a participant in inheritance fraud. He spoke about the stress everyone was feeling since Bobby's death, about the overwhelming responsibility of managing business decisions during the grief process. The expansion plans for the auto parts store were necessary for long-term survival, he explained, not opportunistic profiteering but careful adaptation to changing market conditions. Bobby would have understood the need for growth strategies, even if he had been too conservative during his final years to implement them personally. The explanation sounded reasonable on its surface, but it ignored the timeline issues that made the fraud undeniable. Kevin was asking me to believe that major business decisions had been made and implemented within days of the will reading, that architectural plans and construction contracts had been arranged with impossible speed. Either he was lying about the spontaneous nature of the expansion, or he expected me to accept explanations that violated basic logic and chronology. When I confronted him directly about the forged will and the evidence David Rodriguez had uncovered, Kevin's demeanor shifted noticeably. The warmth disappeared, replaced by the kind of cold assessment I had seen him use with difficult customers at the auto parts store. He suggested that grief had made me susceptible to manipulation by people who specialized in exploiting family conflicts for financial gain. Private investigators, he claimed, were notorious for fabricating evidence that supported whatever narrative their clients wanted to believe. He offered to pay for counseling services to help me process my grief in healthier ways, framing his concern in language that made my pursuit of justice sound like a mental health crisis, rather than a rational response to documented fraud. The offer felt patronizing and insulting, but it also revealed his understanding that emotional manipulation might be more effective than logical argument in changing my behavior. Kevin's visit ended with a warning disguised as brotherly advice. Legal disputes involving family businesses often resulted in everyone losing money to attorneys and investigators who profited from prolonged conflict. Even if I eventually won some kind of settlement, the costs and emotional trauma might exceed any financial benefits. He suggested that accepting the current situation gracefully would allow everyone to move forward with their lives, rather than becoming trapped in years of bitter litigation. The threat was subtler than Linda's direct intimidation, but the message was equally clear. They wanted me to abandon the investigation not because they were confident in their innocence, but because they feared the consequences of having their actions fully exposed and legally challenged. Kevin's offer to pay for counseling was particularly revealing, suggesting that they had resources available to solve problems but chose to use those resources for manipulation rather than restitution. That evening brought a visit from Jessica, who appeared at my apartment door with a bottle of wine and the kind of
tentative smile that suggested she was unsure of her reception. Of all my family members, Jessica had always been the most emotionally intelligent and genuinely caring, which made her potential involvement in the fraud particularly heartbreaking. I wanted to believe that she had been manipulated by Tom and the others rather than being a willing participant in the conspiracy. Jessica's approach was more sophisticated than the obvious manipulation attempts by Linda and Kevin. She acknowledged that the inheritance distribution had seemed unfair, that my exclusion from major family assets was difficult to understand or justify. She expressed genuine sympathy for my financial struggles and admitted that she felt guilty about benefiting from Bobby's estate while I received so little. Her words carried the ring of authentic emotion rather than calculated performance. But even while expressing sympathy, Jessica subtly reinforced the family's narrative about my response to the situation. She worried that I was being taken advantage of by people who didn't really care about my well-being, that my desire for justice was being exploited by professionals who profited from family conflict. Her concern felt genuine, but it was based on accepting the family's version of events rather than examining the evidence of fraud that David Rodriguez had uncovered. She offered to share some of her inheritance with me, suggesting that we could find ways to address the financial disparity without involving attorneys and investigators in private family matters. The offer was generous and probably sincere, but it also revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what had been stolen. The Chicago accounts alone were worth more than the entire estate that had been distributed during the fraudulent will reading, making her proposed solution inadequate even if it had been legally possible. Jessica's visit forced me to confront the possibility that some family members might have been deceived rather than complicit in the fraud. Her emotional reactions seemed authentic, and her offers of help appeared to come from genuine caring rather than strategic manipulation. But her willingness to accept the family's narrative without questioning obvious inconsistencies also suggested a level of willful blindness that enabled the fraud to continue. The conversation became more difficult when I showed Jessica some of the evidence David Rodriguez had provided, including documentation of the forged signatures and fake notary seals. She studied the papers with obvious discomfort, clearly recognizing the implications but reluctant to accept that family members could be capable of such elaborate deception. Her cognitive dissonance was painful to witness, the struggle between loyalty and logic playing out in real time. Jessica eventually admitted that she had noticed some unusual aspects of the will reading process, details that had seemed strange at the time but that she had dismissed as unfamiliarity with legal procedures. Patricia Wells had been different from Margaret Hayes in ways that went beyond simple personality differences, and some of the documentation had looked newer and less formal than what she remembered from other family legal matters.
But even while acknowledging these red flags, Jessica resisted drawing the obvious conclusions about systematic fraud. She preferred to believe in innocent explanations and misunderstandings rather than accepting that people she loved and trusted had been capable of criminal behavior. Her emotional investment in family unity made it nearly impossible for her to process evidence that would require her to choose sides in a conflict that could destroy relationships permanently. The visit ended with Jessica asking me to consider the possibility that everyone could be partially right and partially wrong, that perhaps there had been miscommunication and mistakes rather than deliberate fraud. She suggested that family mediation might resolve the disputes without the adversarial process of legal investigation, allowing everyone to maintain relationships while addressing legitimate grievances about fairness and communication. Her proposal revealed the fundamental challenge of pursuing justice within family systems that prioritized harmony over truth. Jessica genuinely wanted everyone to be happy and reconciled, but her desire for peaceful resolution ignored the criminal nature of what had been done and the legal impossibility of compromising with fraud. Her good intentions made her an unwitting ally of those who had committed serious crimes, providing them with cover and support even when she had no knowledge of their actions. The 3 family visits in one day left me emotionally exhausted but also more certain about the necessity of pursuing legal action. The coordination of their approaches suggested planning and communication, a shared strategy for pressuring me to abandon the investigation through different forms of manipulation. Linda's direct confrontation, Kevin's false concern, and Jessica's appeals to family loyalty were all designed to achieve the same goal of protecting the perpetrators from consequences. I called David Rodriguez that evening to report on the family's pressure campaign and to confirm my commitment to proceeding with both civil and criminal investigations. He listened with the patient attention of someone who had handled similar cases before, offering reassurance that family manipulation was a common response to exposure of inheritance fraud. The desperation of their attempts actually strengthened the case by demonstrating consciousness of guilt and fear of discovery. He explained that the next phase of the investigation would involve formal interviews with witnesses and detailed forensic analysis of all financial transactions related to Bobby's estate. The process would take several months, but the evidence was already strong enough to support both civil recovery actions and criminal referrals to appropriate authorities. The family's reaction to initial inquiries had provided additional documentation of their knowledge and intent. David Rodriguez also warned me to expect escalation in the pressure campaign as the investigation progressed and more evidence was uncovered. Family members involved in inheritance fraud often became increasingly desperate as legal proceedings advanced, sometimes resorting to more aggressive tactics when psychological manipulation proved ineffective. He advised me to document all contact attempts and to avoid private meetings with anyone who might be involved in the conspiracy. The advice proved prophetic when Tom appeared at the bakery the next morning, his presence creating an atmosphere of tension that affected both customers and staff. He demanded to speak with me privately, his tone carrying the kind of authority he used in business negotiations when he expected compliance rather than discussion. Mrs. Murphy refused to allow him into the kitchen, forcing him to state his business in the public area where other people could witness the conversation. Tom's message was direct and unambiguous. The family had consulted with their own attorney, someone with extensive experience in estate law and family disputes. According to their legal counsel, my claims were baseless and potentially actionable as defamation against family members who had done nothing wrong. If I continued to pursue false allegations, I could face countersuits that would leave me responsible for everyone's legal expenses regardless of the investigation's outcome. The threat was more explicit than anything Linda or Kevin had attempted, revealing Tom's role as the primary coordinator of the family's defensive strategy. His confidence suggested that he believed intimidation would be more effective than emotional manipulation, that direct confrontation would convince me to abandon the investigation before it could cause serious damage to their positions. But Tom's approach also revealed significant weaknesses in their legal strategy. If they had been confident in their innocence, they would have welcomed investigation as an opportunity to clear their names and restore family relationships. Instead, they were threatening legal retaliation against someone seeking to recover stolen assets, a response that suggested knowledge of wrongdoing and fear of exposure. I informed Tom that all future communication would need to go through my legal representatives, ending the conversation before it could escalate further. His expression when I delivered this message was a mixture of fury and calculation, the look of someone who had expected easy capitulation and was now forced to consider more complicated strategies for protecting his interests. The encounter confirmed David Rodriguez's warnings about escalation and demonstrated the family's recognition that psychological manipulation had failed to achieve their objectives. They were now moving toward more aggressive tactics, but they were also revealing the depth of their involvement and the extent of their fear about legal consequences. Every interaction provided additional evidence of consciousness of guilt and coordination among the conspirators. That afternoon brought a call from Margaret Hayes with news that accelerated everything. The Chicago bank had completed their internal investigation of the attempts to access Bobby's protected accounts, and their findings provided enough evidence for immediate criminal referrals. The documentation of Patricia Wells's fraudulent contact attempts, combined with the forged probate documents, created a clear case for multiple felony charges including identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. More importantly for my immediate situation, the bank was prepared to release the protected accounts to their legitimate beneficiaries as soon as proper identification and legal documentation could be verified. Margaret Hayes had already begun the process of providing the necessary paperwork, and the funds could be available within days rather than months. The financial security that Bobby had intended to provide was finally within reach, along with the resources necessary to pursue justice effectively. The news transformed my entire perspective on the coming legal battle. Instead of fighting for justice while struggling with financial hardship, I would be able to hire the best legal representation available and pursue both civil and criminal cases with the resources necessary for complete victory. The irony was perfect. Bobby's wisdom in protecting his assets from fraud had provided me with the means to defeat the fraud that had been perpetrated against his estate. I spent that evening organizing all the evidence David Rodriguez had provided, creating detailed files that documented every aspect of the conspiracy and its impact on Bobby's intended legacy. The scope of the fraud was enormous, but so was the strength of the evidence and the resources that would soon be available for pursuing justice. The tools Bobby had left me were proving more powerful than anyone had imagined, not because of their monetary value, but because of the principles they represented and the preparation they had required. The family's desperate attempts at manipulation had only strengthened my resolve and provided additional evidence of their guilt. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the investigation moved into its formal phases, but I was ready for whatever they might attempt. Bobby's legacy would be protected and restored, regardless of how many family relationships had to be sacrificed in the process of achieving justice. Parts 10-14, the deep evidence discovery and final resolution. The call from the Chicago bank came at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a vice president named Catherine Walsh, whose voice carried the crisp professionalism of someone accustomed to handling complex financial situations. She explained that their investigation had uncovered a sophisticated attempt to access Bobby's protected accounts using falsified estate documents, an effort that had triggered their most comprehensive security protocols and resulted in a detailed forensic analysis of all related transactions. The bank's findings were more extensive than even David Rodriguez had anticipated, revealing a conspiracy that stretched back nearly 2 years and involved multiple attempts to gain unauthorized access to Bobby's investment portfolios. Catherine Walsh walked me through a timeline that showed Patricia Wells had been contacting various financial institutions long before Bobby's death, using preliminary versions of forged documents to probe for information about his assets and account structures. The investigation had revealed that Patricia Wells was not actually a licensed attorney but rather a former paralegal who had been disbarred in 2 states for similar fraudulent activities. Her credentials were entirely fabricated, created using sophisticated document forgery techniques that had successfully deceived several institutions before the Chicago bank security specialists identified the inconsistencies. She had been working with a network of accomplices who specialized in inheritance fraud targeting elderly individuals with substantial but complex estate structures. Most significantly for the criminal case, the bank had recorded all of Patricia Wells's phone calls and preserved copies of every fraudulent document she had submitted. The recordings captured her coordination with Tom and Kevin, including specific discussions about timing the fraud to coincide with Bobby's death and strategies for preventing legitimate beneficiaries from discovering the protected accounts. The audio evidence was clear and unambiguous, providing prosecutors with everything they needed for multiple felony convictions. Catherine Walsh informed me that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been notified due to the interstate nature of the fraud and the use of forged federal documents. FBI financial crime specialists were already working with local prosecutors to build cases that could result in sentences of 20 years or more for the primary conspirators. The sophistication of the scheme and the involvement of organized crime elements made this a priority investigation for federal authorities. The bank was prepared to immediately release the protected accounts to their legitimate beneficiaries, but they recommended coordinating the transfer with law enforcement to ensure that the funds could be traced and recovered if any had been illegally accessed. The total value of Bobby's Chicago investments had grown to over $6 million due to market performance and compound interest, making this one of the largest inheritance fraud cases in Ohio history. David Rodriguez arrived at my apartment within an hour of the bank's call, carrying additional evidence that had been developed through his independent investigation. His findings corroborated everything the bank had discovered while adding details about the local aspects of the conspiracy. He had interviewed numerous witnesses who could testify about suspicious activities in the weeks surrounding Bobby's death, including employees at the auto parts stores who had noticed unusual management decisions and financial transfers. The evidence now included security footage from the law office building where the fraudulent will reading had taken place, showing Tom and Kevin meeting with Patricia Wells several days before the scheduled event. The timing proved that the entire proceeding had been rehearsed and coordinated, not a legitimate legal process but rather a theatrical performance designed to deceive family members and create the appearance of proper estate administration. Margaret Hayes had uncovered additional documentation showing that the real estate transactions involving Bobby's properties had been processed using forged signatures and backdated documents. The buyers were shell companies controlled by associates of Patricia Wells, allowing the conspirators to profit from property sales while making the transactions appear legitimate to casual observers. The scope of the fraud had extended to virtually every aspect of Bobby's estate, representing a systematic looting operation rather than simple inheritance manipulation. The forensic accounting revealed that over $3 million in assets had been stolen or redirected through the fraudulent scheme, not including the Chicago accounts that had been protected by their sophisticated security measures. The thieves had been remarkably thorough in their approach, identifying and targeting every source of wealth Bobby had accumulated over his lifetime of business success and careful investment. David Rodriguez explained that the evidence was so overwhelming that plea negotiations would likely begin within days of the formal charges being filed. Federal prosecutors rarely pursued cases this complex unless they were confident of achieving convictions, and the audio recordings from the Chicago bank provided smoking gun evidence that would be impossible to explain away through alternative theories or procedural challenges. The next phase would involve coordinating with law enforcement to ensure that all stolen assets could be recovered and returned to their legitimate owners. This process would require patience and careful documentation, but the legal machinery was now in motion and moving toward inevitable justice. The conspirators would face not only criminal penalties but also civil liability that could result in punitive damages far exceeding the value of what they had stolen. Margaret Hayes called that afternoon with news that changed the timeline dramatically. Tom had contacted her office requesting an immediate meeting to discuss resolving family disputes through negotiation rather than litigation. His lawyer had indicated that all parties were interested in reaching a settlement that would avoid the publicity and expense of criminal proceedings, suggesting that they understood the strength of the evidence and were seeking to minimize their exposure to prosecution. The offer was transparently desperate, coming just hours after they would have been informed about the FBI investigation and the bank's findings. Margaret Hayes explained that settlement negotiations in criminal cases were complicated by the fact that prosecutors, not victims, controlled the charging decisions. Even if I agreed to some form of civil resolution, the criminal investigations would proceed based on the evidence of federal crimes that had been committed. She recommended against any direct contact with family members who might be facing charges, since their communications could be monitored by law enforcement and anything they said could be used as evidence in criminal proceedings. The investigation had moved beyond simple family disputes into federal crime territory, requiring careful coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies and prosecutors who had their own priorities and procedures. The reality of federal criminal charges was beginning to affect the conspirators in ways that went beyond legal jeopardy. Kevin's auto parts expansion plans had been halted when his business loans were frozen pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. Tom's professional reputation in the business community was already suffering as news of the investigation spread through Riverside's tight-knit commercial networks. Linda had been forced to retain a criminal defense attorney, draining resources she had expected to enjoy as part of her inheritance. David Rodriguez warned that the family's desperation might lead to more aggressive attempts at intimidation or manipulation as they faced the reality of serious prison time. People who had believed they could steal millions without consequences were now confronting the possibility of federal convictions that would destroy their lives and reputations permanently. Desperate people often made poor decisions that could complicate an already complex legal situation. His warning proved prophetic when Jessica appeared at my apartment that evening in tears, carrying a suitcase and claiming that she needed somewhere to stay while she sorted through the legal chaos that was destroying her family. Her emotional distress appeared genuine, but her timing was suspiciously convenient given the day's developments in the criminal investigation. She might have been sent by the others to gather information about my legal strategy, or she might have been genuinely seeking refuge from a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Jessica's version of recent events portrayed her as an innocent victim who had been deceived by family members she trusted, someone who had benefited from the fraud without understanding its criminal nature. She claimed that Tom had told her the will changes were legitimate responses to Bobby's concerns about my financial responsibility, that the legal proceedings had been handled by reputable attorneys who specialized in complex estate work. Her story was plausible but incomplete, failing to address obvious warning signs that should have raised questions about the legitimacy of the inheritance process. The sudden appearance of a new attorney, the exclusion of Bobby's longtime legal counsel, the rushed timeline for estate distribution, and the complete secrecy surrounding major financial decisions should have prompted inquiry from anyone paying attention to details. More troubling was Jessica's knowledge of information that she should not have possessed if she had been truly uninformed about the conspiracy. She knew about the Chicago accounts before they had been publicly disclosed, suggesting either guilty knowledge or communication with people who were deeply involved in the fraud. Her emotional appeals for understanding and forgiveness might have been genuine, but they were undermined by evidence that she had known more than she was admitting. I offered Jessica the use of my couch for one night while she made other arrangements, but I made it clear that I could not provide ongoing support to someone who might be facing criminal charges related to the inheritance fraud. The decision felt cruel given her apparent distress, but the legal situation was too complex and serious to risk compromising through emotional responses to family manipulation. The next morning brought a call from Catherine Walsh with news that accelerated everything toward resolution. The FBI had executed search warrants at Tom's and Kevin's homes and businesses, seizing computers, financial records, and documents related to the estate fraud. Patricia Wells had been arrested at her hotel in Columbus, where she had been preparing to flee the state with cash and false identification documents that suggested this was not her first inheritance fraud operation. The arrests had been coordinated to prevent destruction of evidence and communication between conspirators, but they had also created opportunities for cooperation agreements with prosecutors. Patricia Wells was already providing information about the broader network of inheritance fraud specialists she had been working with, revealing that Bobby's estate had been targeted as part of a systematic operation that had victimized families across multiple states. The federal investigation was expanding beyond the immediate family to include professional accomplices who had provided forged documents, fraudulent legal services, and money laundering capabilities that had made the complex fraud possible. The scope of the criminal enterprise was much larger than anyone had initially understood, involving dozens of perpetrators and potentially hundreds of victims whose estates had been targeted using similar methods. Margaret Hayes explained that my cooperation with the investigation was crucial for ensuring that all aspects of the fraud were properly documented and prosecuted. The Chicago bank accounts would be released immediately to provide me with the financial security Bobby had intended, but recovery of the other stolen assets would depend on the success of law enforcement efforts to trace and seize property that had been acquired through criminal activity. The irony of the situation was remarkable. The very sophistication that had made the fraud initially successful was now ensuring its complete exposure and the severe punishment of everyone involved. The audio recordings, digital communications, and financial transactions that had been carefully planned to avoid detection had instead created a comprehensive evidence trail that prosecutors could follow to build cases against every participant in the conspiracy. David Rodriguez met me at the Riverside First National Bank that afternoon to oversee the transfer of funds from Bobby's protected Chicago accounts to new accounts under my direct control. The process required extensive documentation and verification procedures, but Catherine Walsh had coordinated everything to ensure smooth execution of the legitimate inheritance distribution that should have occurred months earlier. Watching the account balances appear on computer screens felt surreal after the months of struggling to pay rent and buy groceries. The numbers represented not just financial security but also vindication of Bobby's love and confirmation that I had been right to fight for justice despite the family pressure to accept the fraudulent settlement. The money was Bobby's final gift, protected by his wisdom and delivered through his careful planning despite the attempts to steal it. The bank's private conference room felt like the appropriate setting for this moment of restoration, so different from the sterile law office where the fraudulent will reading had taken place. Margaret Hayes reviewed the account structures and investment arrangements that Bobby had created, explaining how his financial planning had protected his legacy from exactly the kind of fraud that had been perpetrated against his estate. Bobby had been far more sophisticated in his wealth management than anyone in Riverside had understood, working with specialists in Chicago to create layered protection systems that would preserve his assets regardless of what happened to his local business interests or personal relationships.
His planning had been based on decades of experience watching families destroy themselves through greed and poor financial decisions, and he had designed safeguards that would survive even the most determined theft attempts. The investment portfolios included stocks, bonds, real estate partnerships, and business interests that generated substantial passive income while preserving the principal for long-term growth. Bobby had been particularly focused on creating sustainable wealth that could support multiple generations rather than simply providing immediate gratification for his immediate heirs. His vision had been of a family legacy built on financial responsibility and community service rather than consumption and display. Margaret Hayes handed me the keys to Bobby's farmhouse and the legal documents establishing my ownership of the 38 acres that had been fraudulently sold through the fake estate proceedings. The buyers had been associates of Patricia Wells operating through shell companies, but their transactions were void due to the use of forged signatures and falsified legal authority. The property would be returned along with any improvements that had been made using stolen funds. The afternoon concluded with a meeting at the FBI field office in Cincinnati, where Special Agent Maria Santos briefed me on the criminal cases that would be proceeding against all participants in the inheritance fraud conspiracy. The charges included wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit organized criminal activity, with
potential sentences ranging from 10 to 30 years in federal prison, depending on each defendant's level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. Agent Santos explained that the investigation had revealed a sophisticated criminal network that specialized in targeting elderly individuals with complex estates and limited family oversight. Bobby's case had been selected because his wealth was substantial but not widely known in the community, making it possible to steal significant assets without attracting immediate attention from other potential beneficiaries or business associates. The network included corrupt attorneys, forged document specialists, money laundering operations, and intimidation specialists who worked together to identify targets, execute fraudulent estate transfers, and prevent victims from obtaining legal recourse. Patricia Wells had been a mid-level operator in this network, skilled at impersonating legitimate legal professionals but ultimately expendable when law enforcement pressure made continued operation impossible. The federal investigation was expected to result in dozens of arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets from victims across multiple states. My case had provided the breakthrough that made the broader investigation possible, since the Chicago bank's security measures had preserved evidence that revealed the network's methods and communication patterns. Bobby's careful financial planning had not only protected his own estate but had also helped protect other families from similar victimization. The criminal proceedings would take several months to complete, but the evidence was so overwhelming that plea negotiations were expected to resolve most cases without lengthy trials. The conspirators faced the choice between accepting responsibility and cooperating with prosecutors, or going to trial with evidence that made conviction virtually certain and sentences likely to be more severe due to their lack of cooperation with the investigation. Agent Santos warned that family relationships damaged by criminal proceedings rarely recovered completely, even when justice was achieved and stolen assets were recovered. The betrayal involved in inheritance fraud created wounds that went beyond financial harm to include the destruction of trust and emotional security that had been built over decades of shared experiences and mutual support. But she also emphasized that allowing criminal behavior to go unpunished would have encouraged continued victimization of other families and sent a message that sophisticated fraud could be executed without consequences. The decision to pursue justice rather than accepting fraudulent settlements had protected not only my own interests but also the interests of future victims who might have been targeted by the same criminal network. The drive back to Riverside that evening took me past Bobby's farmhouse, where I stopped to walk through rooms that had been empty for months while the property ownership was disputed through fraudulent legal proceedings. The silence felt peaceful rather than lonely, filled with memories of conversations and shared projects that had shaped my understanding of work, integrity, and family responsibility.
The farmhouse had been Bobby's refuge from the pressures of business success and community obligations, the place where he could focus on simple pleasures like gardening, woodworking, and watching wildlife in the surrounding fields. He had always said that real wealth was measured by the ability to choose how you spent your time rather than by the size of your bank account, though he had been practical enough to ensure that financial security supported rather than constrained those choices. Standing in the kitchen where Bobby and I had shared countless meals and conversations, I felt the weight of responsibility that came with inheriting not just his money but also his values and expectations for how that wealth should be used. The financial security was welcome and necessary, but it also carried obligations to honor his memory through choices that reflected his principles of hard work, community service, and family loyalty properly understood. The tools in Bobby's workshop seemed to glow in the late afternoon light streaming through dusty windows, each implement representing skills and projects that had created value through patient effort and attention to detail. The inheritance I had received was more than money, it was also the knowledge and values that Bobby had shared through our years of working together on problems that required both technical skill and moral clarity. Margaret Hayes called as I was locking the farmhouse to report that Tom and Kevin had agreed to plea bargains that would result in prison sentences of 12 to 15 years each, along with complete restitution of all stolen assets and substantial additional penalties. Linda had also agreed to cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, though she would still face several years in federal prison for her role in the conspiracy. Jessica's situation remained unclear, as prosecutors were still evaluating the extent of her knowledge and involvement in the fraudulent scheme. Her cooperation with the investigation had been helpful, but questions remained about whether her ignorance of criminal activity had been genuine or whether she had chosen to avoid asking questions that might have revealed uncomfortable truths about her inheritance. The plea agreements would result in the complete recovery of all stolen assets plus interest and penalties that would significantly exceed the original value of what had been taken. The financial restitution would be substantial, but the criminal penalties would also serve the broader purpose of deterring similar crimes and protecting other potential victims from inheritance fraud networks. The news of the plea bargains spread quickly through Riverside's business community, creating a mixture of shock and vindication among people who had known Bobby and respected his integrity. Many community members expressed support for my decision to pursue justice despite family pressure to accept the fraudulent settlement, recognizing that allowing such crimes to go unpunished would have encouraged similar victimization of other families. The auto parts business would be sold to pay restitution and criminal penalties, ending the Mitchell family's involvement in the industry that Bobby had developed over decades of careful work and community service. The new owners would be required to honor existing employee agreements and maintain the customer service standards that had made the business successful, but the family legacy in Riverside's commercial life was permanently ended. I spent the following weeks establishing new routines that reflected both my changed financial circumstances and my ongoing commitment to meaningful work. The inheritance had provided security and options that I had never expected to possess, but it had also confirmed Bobby's lessons about the importance of earning satisfaction through effort and contribution rather than simply through consumption of inherited advantages. Mrs. Murphy offered to sell me the bakery building when she learned about my inheritance, explaining that she had been planning retirement but had been concerned about finding a buyer who would maintain the business's role in the community. The opportunity felt like a perfect way to honor Bobby's memory while creating sustainable employment and community value that reflected his principles of responsible business ownership. The purchase would allow me to expand the bakery's operations while preserving its character as a gathering place for neighbors and a source of honest work for people who needed employment opportunities. Bobby had always believed that successful businesses served their communities rather than simply extracting profit from them, and owning the bakery would provide a vehicle for implementing that philosophy in practical ways. The farmhouse became my primary residence, offering space for the woodworking and mechanical projects that Bobby and I had enjoyed together. The workshop was fully equipped with professional quality tools, and the surrounding land provided opportunities for gardening and small-scale agriculture that could supply ingredients for the bakery while maintaining the rural character that Bobby had valued.
The Chicago investment accounts continued to generate substantial income that exceeded my personal needs, creating opportunities for philanthropy and community investment that would extend Bobby's legacy of generous support for local institutions and individuals facing financial hardship. Margaret Hayes helped establish a charitable foundation that could provide scholarships, small business loans, and emergency assistance while operating according to the principles of careful stewardship that Bobby had demonstrated throughout his business career. The foundation's first major project was establishing a scholarship program for young people pursuing technical education and small business development, reflecting Bobby's belief that practical skills and entrepreneurial initiative were more valuable than credentials or inherited advantages. The scholarships would be awarded based on demonstrated work ethic and community commitment rather than academic achievement alone, ensuring that recipients shared Bobby's values of effort and service. The criminal trials concluded 6 months after the initial arrests, resulting in sentences that exceeded what most observers had expected given the cooperation agreements that had been negotiated. The federal judge emphasized the sophisticated nature of the fraud and its impact on community trust, explaining that inheritance crimes struck at fundamental assumptions about family loyalty and legal protection that were essential to social stability. Patricia Wells received the longest sentence, 25 years in federal prison, due to her leadership role in the criminal network and her history of similar crimes in other states. Tom and Kevin each received 15-year sentences despite their cooperation agreements, reflecting the judge's conclusion that their betrayal of family trust was particularly egregious, given their positions of responsibility in Bobby's business and estate planning. Linda's sentence of 8 years reflected her more limited role in the actual execution of the fraud, but the judge noted that her attempts to intimidate me into abandoning the investigation had demonstrated ongoing criminal intent that warranted substantial punishment. Jessica received probation and community service after prosecutors concluded that her involvement had been primarily through willful ignorance rather than active participation in criminal planning. The restitution payments exceeded $12 million, including the recovered stolen assets, interest, penalties, and punitive damages that reflected the severity of the crimes and their impact on both individual victims and community confidence in legal institutions. The money would be used to establish additional charitable programs and community investments that would extend Bobby's positive influence far beyond what he could have achieved through personal effort alone. The Riverside community's response to the resolution of the case was overwhelmingly supportive, with many people expressing admiration for my persistence in pursuing justice despite family pressure to accept fraudulent settlements. Local business leaders emphasized the importance of maintaining ethical standards and legal accountability, noting that allowing such crimes to go unpunished would have undermined confidence in estate planning and family business succession throughout the region. The auto parts stores were eventually sold to a regional chain that maintained most of the existing employees while implementing updated technology and expanded inventory systems. The new ownership preserved the customer service culture that Bobby had established while adapting business operations to contemporary market conditions, ensuring that his positive impact on the local economy would continue despite the criminal destruction of family control. Standing in Bobby's workshop a year after the fraudulent will reading, surrounded by tools that had taught me lessons about patience, precision, and problem solving, I felt grateful for the inheritance that had been restored and the justice that had been achieved. But I also felt the weight of responsibility that came with wealth and community standing, the obligation to use inherited advantages in ways that honored the values and vision of the person who had made them possible. The inheritance fraud had been completely defeated, the criminals had been punished appropriately, and the stolen assets had been recovered with substantial additional penalties that would fund community programs for years to come. But the real victory was not financial or legal, it was the confirmation that Bobby's faith in justice and persistence had been justified, and that his lessons about integrity and courage had provided the foundation for overcoming even sophisticated criminal conspiracies designed to steal both money and memory. The tools Bobby had left me had proved more powerful than anyone could have imagined, not because of their monetary value, but because of the skills and principles they represented.
The inheritance I had received was not just money or property, it was also the knowledge that problems could be solved and justice could be achieved if you were willing to use the right tools applied with patience, determination, and moral clarity that honored the memory of someone who had believed that honest work and fair dealing would eventually triumph over greed and betrayal. The fraudulent will reading replayed in my mind with crystalline clarity as David Rodriguez spread the authentic documents across my kitchen table. Every detail that had felt wrong at the time now revealed itself as part of a carefully orchestrated performance designed to steal not just my inheritance, but my entire understanding of Bobby's love and intentions. The memory felt different now, viewed through the lens of truth rather than the confusion and grief that had clouded my perception during those devastating moments in the fake law office. I could see Patricia Wells's face with perfect clarity, remembering how her smile had never quite reached her eyes, how her handshake had lasted just a fraction too long, how she'd used everyone's names with the calculated frequency of someone following a script about building rapport. Her entire presence had been a performance, from the expensive suit that was meant to project authority to the theatrical way she'd broken the wax seal on the envelope containing the forged will. Every gesture had been designed to sell the legitimacy of proceedings that were completely fabricated. The conference room itself now seemed obviously temporary, lacking the personal touches and established atmosphere that would have characterized Margaret Hayes's longtime practice. The generic artwork on the walls, the absence of personal photographs or professional awards, the way the furniture seemed too new and perfectly arranged rather than worn comfortable by years of client meetings. Patricia Wells had rented the space for a single day, creating a stage set rather than conducting business in a genuine legal office. My family's behavior during the reading took on sinister new meaning when viewed through the knowledge of their complicity. Kevin's confident smirk hadn't been the expression of someone pleasantly surprised by an unexpected inheritance, but rather the satisfaction of someone seeing a long-planned scheme come to fruition. His new leather jacket, which I had noticed even in my grief-stricken state, represented money he had already been spending based on assets he knew he would be stealing from Bobby's true beneficiaries. Tom's authoritative presence throughout the proceeding now revealed itself as the demeanor of someone directing a performance rather than passively receiving news about Bobby's final wishes. He had positioned himself near Patricia Wells in a way that suggested familiarity and coordination, occasionally nodding at points in her presentation that should have been surprises if the will reading had been legitimate. His body language had been that of a co-conspirator rather than a grieving nephew learning about unexpected responsibilities. Linda's studied indifference during the reading, which I had interpreted as her characteristic emotional detachment, was actually the calculated coolness of someone who knew exactly what was going to happen and had prepared herself to show no reaction that might suggest prior knowledge. Her refusal to make eye contact with me hadn't been embarrassment about the disparity in inheritance distribution, but rather the inability to face someone she was actively betraying while maintaining the pretense of innocence. Even Jessica's tears, which had seemed like genuine grief for Bobby's death, took on a different quality when viewed through the knowledge of the family's conspiracy. Her emotional reactions might have been authentic responses to Bobby's death, but her acceptance of the inheritance distribution, without questioning its fairness, suggested either willful blindness or active participation in the fraud. The tissues she had clutched throughout the meeting might have been props in her own performance of surprised grief rather than genuine expressions of loss. The blank paper I had received instead of an inheritance document was perhaps the cruelest touch in the entire fraudulent scheme. It wasn't an oversight or administrative error, but a deliberate message designed to maximize my humiliation and confusion. The conspirators had wanted me to experience the full psychological impact of apparent abandonment and rejection, creating emotional trauma that would make me less likely to question the proceedings or seek independent verification of their legitimacy. David Rodriguez pointed out details in the forged will that revealed the sophisticated nature of the fraud, but also the subtle mistakes that had ultimately exposed the conspiracy. The signature analysis showed that Bobby's name had been traced from other documents rather than signed naturally, creating microscopic variations in pressure and stroke patterns that forensic experts could detect. The paper itself was of a slightly different quality than what Margaret Hayes typically used for legal documents, and the watermark was from a supplier that Bobby's attorney had never utilized. The notary seal that had appeared so official during the reading belonged to someone who had been deceased for over a year, a fact that could have been easily verified if anyone had thought to check the state licensing database. Patricia Wells had apparently obtained the seal through criminal contacts who specialized in providing forged identification and licensing materials, but she had failed to ensure that the supposed notary would appear to be alive and legitimate if investigated. The timeline of the will's creation was also impossible when subjected to scrutiny. The document was dated during a period when Bobby had been hospitalized and heavily sedated, unable to conduct business or make complex legal decisions. Medical records would show that he had been unconscious or incoherent during the days when he supposedly met with Patricia Wells to revise his estate planning and exclude me from his inheritance. Margaret Hayes's sudden retirement, which Patricia Wells had explained as health-related, was actually the result of deliberate interference with her ability to represent Bobby's estate. Someone had contacted her malpractice insurance carrier with false complaints designed to create professional liability issues that would prevent her from handling probate proceedings. The timing had been carefully coordinated to ensure that she would be unavailable during the critical period when the fraudulent will was being fought and processed. The speed with which the estate had been distributed after the fake will reading should have raised immediate red flags for anyone familiar with probate procedures. Legitimate estate administration typically required months of court supervision, creditor notification periods, and detailed accounting of all assets and distributions. The conspirators had bypassed all normal safeguards by filing falsified court documents that made the estate appear simpler and less valuable than it actually was. David Rodriguez showed me copies of the real estate transactions that had been processed using the forged probate documents, revealing a network of shell companies and straw buyers that had been established specifically to receive and launder the stolen property. The buyers weren't legitimate purchasers but rather associates of Patricia Wells who had been prepared to receive the assets and transfer them to offshore accounts where they would be difficult to trace and recover. The auto parts business expansion that Kevin and Tom had implemented so quickly after the will reading had been financed using credit lines that were secured by Bobby's business assets, loans that had been arranged weeks before his death, using falsified authorization documents. They had been converting the business inventory to cash and transferring the proceeds to personal accounts, systematically looting the company that Bobby had spent decades building into a community institution. The charitable foundation that had been mentioned during the will reading was also part of the fraudulent scheme, designed to provide the conspirators with a vehicle for controlling additional assets while maintaining the appearance of philanthropic intent. The foundation's board structure would have given Tom and Kevin complete authority over substantial endowment funds, allowing them to pay themselves generous hours and administrative fees while providing minimal actual charitable services. The sophistication of the fraud extended to psychological manipulation techniques that had been designed to prevent me from questioning the inheritance distribution or seeking independent verification of its legitimacy. Patricia Wells had used specific language patterns and emotional triggers that were calculated to create confusion, self-doubt, and acceptance of unfair treatment. The fake sympathy and manufactured explanations had been crafted by professionals who understood how to exploit grief and family dynamics for criminal purposes. David Rodriguez explained that inheritance fraud had become increasingly sophisticated as criminal organizations recognized the vulnerability of families dealing with death and estate administration. The perpetrators often spent months researching their targets, learning about family relationships, business structures, and personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited to facilitate theft and prevent detection. Bobby's case had been selected because his wealth was substantial but not widely publicized, making it possible to steal significant assets without attracting immediate attention from the broader community. The emotional impact of understanding the full scope of the betrayal was almost overwhelming, requiring me to reconceptualize not just the will reading, but years of family interactions that had apparently been building toward this moment of theft and abandonment. Conversations I had interpreted as genuine expressions of love and concern were actually intelligence-gathering operations designed to help the conspirators understand how to most effectively steal my inheritance and prevent me from seeking justice. The tools Bobby had left me in his authentic will were revealed to be far more valuable than their monetary worth, representing both practical skills and moral principles that would be essential for recovering what had been stolen and ensuring that justice was served. The screwdrivers and wrenches were symbols of his belief in the power of honest work and persistent effort to solve even the most complex problems, qualities that would be necessary for dismantling the criminal conspiracy that had targeted his estate. Margaret Hayes's voice cracked with emotion when she called that evening to apologize for the months of delay in discovering and exposing the fraud. She had been systematically excluded from Bobby's estate administration through a series of legal maneuvers that she was only beginning to understand, but she accepted responsibility for failing to protect her longtime client's final wishes from criminal manipulation. Her guilt was palpable, but so was her determination to ensure that complete justice was achieved and that every stolen asset was recovered with appropriate penalties. The Chicago bank's security protocols had ultimately saved Bobby's most valuable assets from theft, but the emotional trauma of believing that I had been abandoned and rejected by someone I loved deeply had inflicted damage that would take time to heal. The months of financial struggle and social isolation had been unnecessary suffering caused by criminals who had profited from the destruction of family relationships and the perversion of Bobby's generous intentions. David Rodriguez warned that the legal battle ahead would be lengthy and emotionally challenging, requiring sustained effort over many months to fully expose the criminal network and recover all stolen assets. The perpetrators would likely attempt additional manipulation and intimidation tactics as they realized that their fraud had been discovered and that serious legal consequences were inevitable. But he also expressed confidence that the evidence was overwhelming and that complete victory was not just possible, but inevitable. The revelation that Bobby had actually left me the controlling interest in his business empire and the majority of his personal wealth felt like resurrection from an emotional death that had lasted for months. The inheritance wasn't just money and property, it was also the confirmation that I had been loved and valued by someone whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's. The tools in his workshop weren't consolation prizes, but rather symbols of the practical skills and moral courage that would be necessary for honoring his memory and protecting his legacy from those who had tried to destroy it. Standing in my small apartment that night, surrounded by evidence of the most sophisticated betrayal I could have imagined, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Bobby's death, the certainty that I was exactly where he had intended me to be, equipped with exactly the tools I would need to fight for justice and restore the legacy he had worked his entire life to create. The criminals had underestimated both Bobby's wisdom in protecting his assets and my determination to honor his memory, regardless of the personal costs involved. The blank paper from the fraudulent will reading was still folded in my wallet, kept as a reminder of the cruelty that people could inflict on those who trusted them. But now, it represented something different, evidence of criminal conspiracy rather than proof of abandonment, a piece of the puzzle that would help prosecutors build their case rather than a symbol of my worthlessness. The transformation in meaning reflected the broader change in my understanding of everything that had happened since Bobby's death. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of a legal battle that would consume months of my life and require courage I wasn't sure I possessed. But tonight, surrounded by the tools Bobby had left me and the evidence of his continued protection, even from beyond the grave, I felt ready to fight for justice with the persistence and precision he had taught me through years of shared projects and conversations about the importance of doing difficult jobs properly. The fraudulent will reading had been designed to destroy my spirit and prevent me from claiming what Bobby had intended to give me. Instead, it had become the foundation for exposing a criminal conspiracy and recovering an inheritance that would honor his memory through decades of community service and responsible stewardship. The tools he had left me were more powerful than anyone could have imagined, and I was finally ready to use them for the purpose he had always intended, building something lasting and meaningful from the materials at hand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.